The current government's embrace of the need for reconciliation and healing after Sri Lanka's 26-year conflict has enabled steady progress in U.S.-Sri Lankan relations over the last 10 years. The U.S. and Sri Lanka now have regular, constructive, high-level diplomatic contacts. And until the U.S. withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council, we were co-sponsoring the famous resolution on Sri Lanka starting in 2015. So we turned an area of friction into an area of collaboration between our two countries, which was very, very important. I'm also pleased that our military-to-military relations have expanded from the days when I was ambassador. In the last years of the war in 2008 and 2009, human rights concerns almost completely circumscribed what we were able to do on the military front. We stopped exercises, we stopped training, we stopped almost everything with the Sri Lankan Army and the Sri Lankan Air Force. The only exception was the Navy, and there, as I was telling the Admiral, I fought very hard to maintain contacts with the Navy, because first of all, I felt they were extremely important. Secondly, the Navy was not guilty of serious human rights abuses. And thirdly, we had a direct interest in helping Sri Lanka to stop these arms shipments to the LTT in the north, because of course we didn't want to see those be used against innocent civilians. Today, I'm really happy to see that all of the restrictions that we had placed in 2008 and 2009 have all been removed. And in fact, our military is looking for ways, in every way we can, to support the growth of the Sri Lankan military across the board, all the services. So now our two militaries train together in areas ranging from maritime security to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We've announced plans for new security assistance of $39 million to support maritime security and freedom of navigation and maritime domain awareness so that you know more of what's going on in your own waters. In 2018, the U.S. Coast Guard transferred a cutter to the Sri Lankan Navy. And now, of course, we have regular joint training exercises with all of the services. So all of these are signs of a healthy and growing military-to-military partnership, and I'm very happy about that. Likewise, our law enforcement cooperation has strengthened, and obviously there's no better sign of that than the immediate deployment that took place of FBI personnel here to help with the investigation of the Easter bombings. And I'm happy that that is still ongoing and hopefully will continue well beyond this phase of the attack. Our economic relations likewise have seen welcome progress. Over the past 10 years, our two-way trade has increased by 40% to $3.2 billion. And as Mahesh said, the United States remains Sri Lanka's largest export market. And US companies have invested approximately $300 million here in Sri Lanka, generating obviously many high-quality jobs for the Sri Lankan people. A last sign of progress is an institution that not many Sri Lankans know very much about, but it's called the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And when I was ambassador, unfortunately, I had the misfortune of having to preside over the cancellation of an MCC program because MCC is basically a program that rewards good governance. And in 2006, as the war really started to gear up again, there were mounting problems with governance of all kinds and human rights problems. And so the MCC program was suspended and then finally canceled. And of course, that was a real shame. And so I'm really happy that just on April 25th, just a few weeks ago, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Board voted to approve a new compact agreements for Sri Lanka that will really help to expand economic opportunities for Sri Lankan people and reduce poverty. The exact nature of that program still has to be negotiated. Really, the government itself will decide how they want to spend that money. But I think it's a really important signal of confidence by the United States and by the Congress that we have faith in Sri Lanka's future, and we have faith in the improving governance situation in this country. All right. Let me now turn to some thoughts about how Sri Lanka can sustain all of this progress in relations with the United States, particularly given the challenges posed by the terrible Easter Sunday bombings. My old boss, Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns, who is probably the most respected American diplomat of the last 25 years, used to joke that American diplomats are never shy about giving advice, and that usually that advice is unwelcome. So hopefully this advice will not be too unwelcome. The Easter attacks were not just obviously personal tragedies for the families of those who were killed and wounded. They also opened up old wounds that were still fresh from Sri Lanka's 26-year civil conflict. And they raised new questions in the minds of potential business partners about the wisdom of doing business here in Sri Lanka. So what steps should Sri Lanka take to successfully manage these new challenges and sustain its progress of the last 10 years? Job one, of course, has to be to pursue with vigor the investigation into who was responsible, what links they had to outside terrorist groups, how the bombers were able to mount such a sophisticated operation and well-coordinated series of attacks in multiple cities without detection, where the 7 billion rupees in financing that was found in some of the bombers' accounts, where did all that money come from? And what networks still remain so that the Sri Lankan people can really be sure that the threat has abated? One priority during this phase of investigating and hopefully wrapping up any remaining terrorist elements must be for the government and security services to conduct investigations in a professional and impartial manner that respects the rights of all Sri Lankans and does not inadvertently add to the problem. And the government should also make every effort to limit the scope and duration of any emergency regulations. And I must say, since I've been here for the last 2 days, I've heard quite encouraging reports of how the security services in general have conducted themselves. So well done on that. I think Sri Lanka can learn from the mistakes that America made after 9/11 as well. Most civil liberties experts believe that the United States overreacted after the 9/11 attacks by expanding government surveillance without appropriate constitutional checks, by extended detentions at Guantanamo Bay that circumscribed the legal rights of detainees, by extraordinary renditions and interrogations, all of which gave rise to questions about what the limits of government power should be in times of crisis. Ultimately, our system of checks and balances righted most of these wrongs. And I must say the press had a very powerful role to play in our country in exposing the excesses that did take place and putting pressure on our political leaders to change and respond to these concerns. I think Sri Lanka can also benefit from another US lesson that we learned after 9/11. One of our biggest mistakes that led to 9/11 was our failure to properly communicate between our intelligence and law enforcement agencies, particularly the FBI and the CIA and the various law enforcement agencies. So to improve interagency communication and coordination, then President Bush ordered a new committee to be established under one of the deputy national security advisors in the White House, a guy called John Brennan, who later became the head of the CIA, a very competent guy. And under John Brennan, they had very, very senior people of all of the relevant intelligence and law enforcement experts. And they met on a weekly basis to evaluate all of the intelligence against the United States and to determine what was credible, and then most importantly, to take action against those credible things. And individual people were specifically assigned responsibility for each one of the leads that were considered credible. And as a result of that, we haven't had a successful terrorist attack by a foreign terrorist group since then. We've had plenty of domestic terrorist problems, but we haven't had, ISIS and Al-Qaeda have not really been able to attack, like they did in Paris or any number of other places. So I think having a high-level group of technocrats like that is something that Sri Lanka could definitely benefit from. And we were talking earlier that, in fact, you did have such a group before the war and during the war, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa was defense secretary, and he personally chaired that and made sure that all of the different branches of intelligence, of which there are many in this country, were sharing information and then sharing that information up to the senior level people, and then they themselves were making sure that somebody was looking into those and making sure that the attacks didn't take place. So I think that's a very important thing that current government should think about, is reestablishing some kind of group like that. Sri Lanka also must be very careful not to allow ISIS or other extreme Islamic groups to take root here in Sri Lanka. Right after the Easter bombings, I was asked to give a lot of interviews on CNN and so forth, and they asked me if I was surprised about the attacks, and I said yes, I was surprised, because traditionally relations between Muslims and Christians have been pretty good. And to the extent that the Muslims had grievances against anybody, it would be more against maybe BBS or against the Tamils, who expelled a lot of Muslims from the north. But really the relations between Christians and Muslims have been on the whole quite good. So it was a bit of a surprise to see these attacks take place against Catholic churches, for example.